The grand hall was a spectacle of opulence, with gold-accented chandeliers hanging like floating stars, casting a warm glow over the gathering of the city's most elite and influential individuals. Guests dressed in designer suits and glamorous gowns moved about, their conversations blending into a hum of sophistication. Laughter rang out here and there, punctuated by the clinking of crystal glasses filled with the finest champagne. Anthony and Elizabeth stood at the center of it all, the spotlight firmly fixed on them. Elizabeth's ivory gown, fitted to perfection, shimmered under the light, and her smile was as radiant as the diamonds adorning her neck. To the untrained eye, they looked like the epitome of love and success. Anthony, tall and impeccably dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, exuded power and confidence, his arm draped possessively around Elizabeth's waist. Yet, beneath her polished exterior, Elizabeth felt like a bird trapped in a golden cage. Her smile was practiced, each curve of her lips carefully orchestrated to hide the growing unease in her chest. She shifted slightly in Anthony's grip, but his hand tightened around her waist, pulling her closer. The gesture looked affectionate to the guests, but Elizabeth knew better. It was a silent command to stay in place, to be the perfect bride he expected. Elizabeth leaned closer, her voice a near whisper. "Anthony, could you loosen your grip? I can barely breathe." Anthony glanced at her briefly, his expression unchanging. His voice was low but firm. "You're fine. Stop fidgeting. Everyone is watching." She bit her lip, her discomfort growing. Around them, the guests engaged in lively conversations, their laughter echoing through the hall. But Elizabeth couldn't focus on anything except the oppressive weight of Anthony's presence. She glanced at the crowd, hoping for a familiar, friendly face, but all she saw were judgmental eyes and polite, superficial smiles. Her mother had always told her that marrying Anthony was the best decision she could make. "He's powerful, Elizabeth," her mother had said. "He'll give you a life others can only dream of." But standing there, under the watchful eyes of strangers, Elizabeth wondered if this was the life she wanted. As the ceremony progressed, Elizabeth could hear snippets of conversations floating through the air. Guests discussed everything from business deals to vacation homes. It was all so polished, so perfect, yet it felt hollow to her. Then, like a crack in the carefully constructed facade, she caught a fragment of a conversation that made her blood run cold. "Did you hear about her and Michael?" a woman's voice said, barely above a whisper. "Oh, yes," the musician, another replied. "They were quite the pair back in the day. I wonder if Anthony knows." Elizabeth stiffened. Her heart raced as she glanced around, hoping Anthony hadn't overheard. But when she looked at him, his jaw was tight, his eyes narrowed slightly as if he were straining to catch every word. The mention of Michael's name was like a spark in a room full of gas, dangerous and volatile. Elizabeth turned to Anthony, her voice soft but urgent. "Anthony, it's just gossip. You know how people love to talk at these events." He didn't look at her, his smile frozen in place for the benefit of the watching crowd. "Is it true?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with an edge she hadn't heard before. Her stomach twisted. "It's in the past. Michael and I weren't friends. That's all." Anthony's eyes flickered to her, and she could see the storm brewing behind them. "Friends," he repeated, his tone almost mocking. "Funny, that's not what they're saying." Elizabeth felt her throat tighten. She looked around nervously, noticing how some guests were glancing their way, their curiosity piqued by the subtle tension between the bride and groom. "Anthony, please," she whispered, her voice pleading. "Let's not make a scene." But Anthony wasn't listening. His grip on her waist tightened further, making her wince. "Why didn't you tell me about him before?" he asked, his voice still low but increasingly icy. "Was it because you thought it wasn't important, or because you were hiding something?" Elizabeth's cheeks flushed with embarrassment and frustration. "I didn't tell you because it didn't matter," she said, her voice trembling. "Michael was a part of my past a long time ago. I didn't think it was relevant." Anthony let out a sharp breath, his jaw clenching. "Not relevant?" he repeated. "Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" "How you make me look?" standing here listening to these people whisper about how my wife was once involved with some musician. Elizabeth felt the sting of his words, but she tried to maintain her composure. You're overreacting, she said, her voice barely audible. This is our wedding day. Can we just focus on us? Anthony finally turned to look at her, his gaze hard and unforgiving. No, Elizabeth. I can't just ignore this. Not when you've made a fool out of me in front of everyone. Elizabeth blinked back tears, the lump in her throat growing. She wanted to shout at him, to tell him he was being unfair, but the weight of the crowd's eyes and the fear of escalating the situation held her back. Instead, she took a deep breath and tried to steady her voice. Anthony, please, she said, her tone soft but firm. I love you. I chose you. Michael is in the past, and he has nothing to do with us. Can't we leave it at that? For a moment, Anthony didn't respond. His face was a mask of conflict, his pride and insecurity warring with each other. Then, with a forced smile, he said, Fine, but we're not done talking about this. Elizabeth nodded, relieved but still tense. As the guests' attention shifted back to their conversations, she felt Anthony's grip on her waist relax slightly. But the damage was done. The night no longer felt magical. It felt like a performance, and Elizabeth was exhausted from playing her role. As the music swelled and guests returned to their laughter and clinking glasses, Elizabeth stood beside Anthony, her smile still in place, but her heart heavy. She glanced at him, hoping for a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with, but all she saw was someone she barely recognized, a man consumed by his need for control and his fear of being seen as anything less than perfect. Elizabeth turned her gaze to the crowd, the murmur of conversations now a blur in her mind. The name Michael hung in the air like a ghost, haunting the night that was supposed to be the beginning of her happily ever after. All she could do now was wait and hope that the storm brewing within Anthony wouldn't ruin everything she had worked so hard to build. For the rest of the evening, Elizabeth felt like she was walking on eggshells. She laughed when the guests laughed, nodded politely when spoken to, and danced with Anthony under the admiring eyes of the crowd. But every moment felt like a lie, a fragile illusion that could shatter with the slightest provocation. Anthony's smile remained fixed, but Elizabeth could feel the tension radiating from him. She wondered if anyone else noticed the cracks in their perfect image, or if they were all too busy enjoying the spectacle. As the night dragged on, Elizabeth's mind kept returning to the same question. Had she made the right choice? And if not, was it too late to change her mind? The soft hum of chatter and music from the main hall faded as Anthony led Elizabeth to a secluded corner near the grand staircase. His grip on her wrist was firm but not painful, yet it conveyed an unmistakable urgency. Elizabeth could feel her heart pounding in her chest as the tension between them grew with every step. Once they were out of sight, Anthony let go of her wrist and turned to face her, his jaw tight and his eyes blazing with barely contained anger. He took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling, but the effort to calm himself was futile. When he spoke, his voice was sharp, cutting through the relative quiet like a blade. "How dare you embarrass me like this?" he hissed, keeping his voice low enough not to draw attention but cold enough to send a shiver down Elizabeth's spine. Elizabeth blinked, her chest tightening. "Anthony, what are you talking about?" she asked softly, though she already had an idea. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," he shot back, his tone laced with accusation. "Michael. His name is on everyone's lips tonight." "Why?" Elizabeth stepped back slightly, wrapping her arms around herself as if to shield herself from his piercing gaze. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "Michael is in the past. You know that." Anthony let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Do I?" he snapped. "If he's so far in the past, then why is everyone here whispering about him? Why are people looking at me like I'm some kind of fool for marrying you?" Elizabeth's eyes widened, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "That's not fair," she said, her voice cracking. "I've done nothing to make you feel that way. People talk, Anthony. They twist things. You can't control that." Anthony's glare didn't soften. If anything, it grew colder. Then why didn't you tell me about him before? He demanded. If he's so irrelevant, why did you hide it from me? I didn't hide anything, Elizabeth protested, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and lowered it again. Michael was a part of my life a long time ago. It wasn't serious, and it didn't last. I didn't think it mattered. Anthony took a step closer, his presence looming over her. Didn't matter? He repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. You didn't think it was important to tell your husband that you were involved with someone people apparently still remember well enough to gossip about on our wedding day? Elizabeth felt the sting of his words, and tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She hated that he could make her feel so small, so guilty for something she couldn't control. Anthony, I can't change the past, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I chose you. Doesn't that mean something? Anthony's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw clenching again. What means something, he said, his voice low and steady but filled with venom, is that you've put me in a position where I look weak. Do you know what that does to a man like me? Elizabeth shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. This isn't about you looking weak, Anthony, she said, her tone firmer now. This is about trust. I trusted you to see me for who I am now, not to hold my past against me. Anthony's eyes narrowed, and he crossed his arms over his chest. You call this trust? He asked, his voice rising slightly. You expect me to just ignore the fact that people are whispering about how my wife used to be with some musician? Do you have any idea what that does to my reputation? Elizabeth's mouth fell open in disbelief. Your reputation? She echoed. That's what this is about? Not us, not our relationship, but how people see you. Anthony's silence was telling. He looked away briefly, his lips pressing tighter together, but he didn't deny it. Elizabeth took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. Anthony, I love you, she said, her voice softer again. I chose you because I believed in us. But this isn't fair. I can't be held responsible for what people say. And I can't keep defending myself against something that's not even real. Anthony's gaze snapped back to hers, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something softer in his eyes. Hurt, maybe, or confusion. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold mask he had been wearing all evening. You should have told me, he said finally, his voice quieter but no less sharp. You should have trusted me enough to tell me the truth. Elizabeth felt her chest tighten again, a tear slipping down her cheek despite her best efforts to hold it back. I didn't think it would matter, she said quietly. I didn't think you would care about someone who's been out of my life for years. Clearly, I was wrong. Anthony stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The music from the hall drifted into the silence between them, a stark contrast to the tension hanging in the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with finality. We'll talk about this later, he said, straightening his jacket as if to regain his composure. But don't think for a second that this conversation is over. Elizabeth nodded, her heart sinking. She watched as Anthony turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the quiet corner. Her hands trembled as she wiped the tear from her cheek, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on her. For the first time, she wondered if the man she had fallen in love with was still there, or if he had been replaced by the person she had just faced. The grand reception hall was alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses as the evening reached its peak. Guests mingled freely, their polished appearances a testament to the grandeur of the occasion. Yet, amidst the glittering ambience, a thick tension lingered around Anthony and Elizabeth like a dark cloud. Elizabeth stood by the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to keep her composure. She could feel Anthony's piercing gaze from across the room, even as he engaged in polite conversations with a group of men. Her heart raced, each beat a reminder of the earlier confrontation in the corner of the hall. She thought she could manage the rest of the evening without incident, but she underestimated the power of whispered gossip and alcohol-fueled indiscretions. It started with a guest, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit who had perhaps had one glass of champagne too many. His laughter rang out as he turned to Anthony, a mischievous glint in his eye. Anthony, the man said, his voice carrying over the hum of the crowd. "I couldn't help but notice. Is it true your lovely bride once dated that musician? What's his name? Michael?" He chuckled, oblivious to the growing tension in the air. "I hear he's still quite the charmer. Bet she has a few stories to tell." The room seemed to freeze in that moment. Conversations faltered, and curious eyes turned toward the bride and groom. Elizabeth felt her stomach drop. Her cheeks flushed hot with embarrassment as every whispered rumor from earlier now seemed amplified tenfold. Anthony's hand tightened around the stem of his champagne flute. His jaw clenched so hard it looked as though he might crack his teeth. The laughter of the guests died away as he finally registered the change in Anthony's demeanor, but by then, it was too late. Anthony turned sharply, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "Elizabeth," he called, his voice loud enough to cut through the silence that had fallen over the room. Elizabeth froze. She could feel every eye in the hall fixed on her, their judgmental gazes burning into her skin. Slowly, she turned to face him, her heart pounding. Anthony stalked toward her, his movements deliberate and filled with purpose. "Why didn't you tell me," he began, his voice loud and accusatory, "that you still talk to him?" Elizabeth's eyes widened in shock. "I don't talk to him," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. "Anthony, this is a misunderstanding. Don't lie to me," Anthony interrupted, stepping closer. His voice was sharp and booming, carrying across the room. "Do you have any idea how this makes me look? How you've humiliated me in front of everyone here?" Elizabeth's lips parted, but no words came out. Her mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. "I've done nothing wrong," she managed to say, her voice shaky. "I don't know why people are saying these things, but I swear to you I haven't spoken to Michael in years." Her words only seemed to inflame Anthony further. He took another step forward, the space between them shrinking as he loomed over her. "Don't pretend to be innocent," he shouted. "You've made a fool out of me. Do you think I'd let that slide?" Elizabeth's cheeks burned with humiliation. She felt as though the walls of the hall were closing in on her, suffocating her under the weight of the stares and murmurs around them. "Anthony, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Let's talk about this privately. This isn't the time or place." But Anthony wasn't listening. His anger had consumed him, and he was past the point of reason. "You think I care about that right now?" he snapped. "You've embarrassed me in front of all these people, and you expect me to stay quiet?" Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes. She wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but her feet felt glued to the floor. "I love you, Anthony," she said softly, hoping to reach the man she once knew. "Why won't you believe me?" Her words seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, in an instant, it happened. Anthony's hand shot out, and the sound of the slap echoed through the room like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Elizabeth stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek. The sting of the blow was sharp, but the pain in her heart was even sharper. For a moment, the entire hall was frozen in stunned silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The guests stared in disbelief, their faces a mix of shock and horror. Elizabeth's vision blurred with tears as she steadied herself. Her cheek throbbed, and the weight of the humiliation crushed her chest. She looked up at Anthony, her eyes filled with pain and betrayal. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Anthony's expression shifted. For a brief moment, regret flickered across his face, but it was quickly replaced by a mask of cold indifference. He looked around at the guests, his pride refusing to let him acknowledge his mistake. The murmurs began to grow louder. "Did you see that?" someone whispered. "He actually hit her," another exclaimed. A woman in a gold gown stepped forward, her voice trembling with outrage. "This is unacceptable," she said, glaring at Anthony. "You can't treat her like that." Anthony ignored her, his attention fixed on Elizabeth. "You brought this on yourself," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. Elizabeth shook her head, her tears now flowing freely. "No, Anthony," she said, her voice stronger despite the tremor. "You did this. You ruined everything." With that, She turned and fled, her gown trailing behind her as she pushed through the crowd. Some guests moved to follow her, while others remained frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Anthony stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, as the weight of what he had done began to sink in. But the damage was done. The perfect image of their wedding had shattered, leaving behind only the broken pieces of a love that once seemed unbreakable. The grand hall was suspended in a deafening silence, broken only by the faint hum of the chandelier lights and the soft rustle of fabric as guests shifted uneasily in their spots. The sharp sound of the slap lingered in the air, as though the echo itself refused to fade. Elizabeth stood motionless, her eyes wide with shock as tears brimmed and threatened to spill down her cheeks. Her hand instinctively pressed against her throbbing cheek, but the pain was not what paralyzed her. It was the crushing weight of betrayal and humiliation. Her mind raced, replaying the moment over and over, unable to believe what had just happened. She blinked rapidly, willing herself to wake up from what felt like a nightmare, but the shocked, horrified expressions on the faces of the guests confirmed the reality. This wasn't a dream. It was all too real. Gasps and murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. Whispers rose like an undertone to the tension that hung in the air. Did that really just happen? I can't believe he hit her. On their wedding day? Elizabeth's chest tightened as the humiliation sank deeper. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, to cry out that this wasn't her fault, but her voice failed her. The room blurred as tears finally spilled over, streaking her perfectly applied makeup. Anthony, meanwhile, stood frozen in place, his hand still half raised as though his mind had not caught up to his body. His chest heaved as the anger drained from him, replaced by something colder and heavier, regret. He looked around, seeing the shocked and disapproving stares from the guests, but his gaze quickly returned to Elizabeth. Her tears, her trembling form, her utter disbelief, it all hit him like a punch to the gut. Elizabeth, he began, his voice barely audible. He took a hesitant step forward, his hand falling limply to his side. She flinched as he moved closer, stepping back instinctively. The movement wasn't large, but it was enough to stop Anthony in his tracks. Her reaction was more powerful than any words she could have spoken. Elizabeth's voice finally broke through the lump in her throat. "How could you?" she whispered, her tone shaky but filled with pain. "How could you do this to me? To us?" Anthony opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? Sorry? It felt meaningless now, hollow and inadequate in the face of what he had done. The murmurs around them grew louder, and a few guests began to move toward Elizabeth. One woman, an older guest in a navy blue gown, reached out to her. "Elizabeth, my dear, are you all right?" she asked gently, her voice laced with concern. Elizabeth didn't respond. Her legs felt weak, her body trembling. All she could think about was escape, getting as far away as possible from the stifling room, the prying eyes, and, most of all, Anthony. With a sudden burst of movement, she turned and ran, her white gown billowing behind her. The sound of her heels clicking against the polished floor echoed through the silent hall as she pushed through the heavy doors and disappeared into the night. "Elizabeth!" Anthony called after her, his voice rising in desperation. He took a step as though to follow, but a few of the guests stepped forward, blocking his path. "You've done enough," one man said firmly, his voice low but filled with disapproval. Anthony stopped, his fists clenching at his sides. His jaw tightened as his gaze flicked to the others in the room. Their eyes bore into him, some filled with judgment, others with a mix of pity and disgust. The realization of what he had done began to sink in fully. Meanwhile, the hall was abuzz with murmurs and whispers. "I can't believe he actually hit her. And in front of everyone, no less. What a disgrace. Poor girl." A younger woman in a red dress shook her head, her voice rising above the others. "This is unacceptable. Someone needs to check on her." She hurried toward the doors Elizabeth had fled through, followed by a few others who shared her concern. Anthony stood rooted to the spot, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a leaden cloak. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. He could barely register the movement of the guests around him. Some avoided his gaze entirely, whispering as they retreated to the corners of the room. Others stared openly, their expressions a mix of disbelief and disapproval. One older man, a close friend of Anthony's father, stepped forward. "Anthony," he said quietly, his tone heavy with disappointment. "What were you thinking?" Anthony's mouth opened, but no words came out. He shook his head slightly, as if trying to shake off the reality of the moment. I didn't mean to," he started, but the man held up a hand to silence him. "Not here," the man said sternly. "You need to figure out how to make this right. And you'd better do it quickly." Anthony nodded mutely, his mind racing but finding no clear path forward. Across the hall, a group of women were huddled together, whispering furiously. "She's never going to forgive him for this," one of them said. "Forgive him," another scoffed. "She should leave him right now. No woman deserves to be treated like that." The whispers grew louder as more guests joined the conversation, and soon, the entire hall buzzed with speculation and condemnation. Outside the hall, Elizabeth stood in the cool night air, her hands gripping the railing of the steps as she tried to steady herself. Her chest heaved with sobs, the cool breeze brushing against her tear-streaked face. A few guests who had followed her kept a respectful distance, unsure of what to say or do. One of them, the woman in the red dress, finally approached cautiously. "Elizabeth," she said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right? Do you want me to call someone for you?" Elizabeth shook her head, unable to speak. The pain in her cheek was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. She had trusted Anthony, loved him, and now that trust lay shattered, scattered like the pieces of her pride on the cold ground. Back in the hall, Anthony finally began to move, walking toward the doors. But the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. The murmurs didn't stop, and the eyes didn't look away. The grand wedding that was supposed to be the beginning of their happily ever after had turned into a spectacle of humiliation and chaos. As the night dragged on, the guests began to leave, their conversations filled with what they had witnessed. Some expressed outrage, others pity, but all carried with them the story of the slap that had turned a celebration into a scandal. And as the last of the champagne glasses were cleared away and the lights dimmed, the hall that had once been filled with joy and laughter stood empty, haunted by the echoes of a love gone terribly wrong. Elizabeth slipped away from the chaos of the reception hall, the noise of murmuring guests and clinking glasses fading behind her. She found a quiet corner outside the venue, away from the glaring lights and prying eyes. It was dimly lit, with the soft glow of a nearby lamp casting long shadows on the ground. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she sank onto the cold stone steps, her wedding gown pooling around her like a defeated flag. Her tears flowed freely now, no longer held back by the weight of maintaining appearances. Her chest heaved with each sob, the pain in her heart far greater than the sting of the slap on her cheek. She buried her face in her trembling hands, her mind replaying the events of the evening in an endless, torturous loop. "This wasn't how it was supposed to be," she whispered to herself, her voice breaking. "This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life." Her words were swallowed by the quiet night, but she felt the weight of them pressing down on her. She had dreamed of this day since she was a little girl, imagining a fairy tale wedding filled with love and joy. Instead, it had turned into a nightmare, one she couldn't wake up from. The sound of hurried footsteps broke through her sobs, and she looked up to see Sarah, her closest friend, rushing toward her. Sarah's face was etched with worry as she crouched down beside Elizabeth, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Elizabeth," Sarah said softly, her voice steady, but filled with concern. "I've been looking for you everywhere. Are you okay?" Elizabeth shook her head, unable to form words. Her tears flowed harder, and Sarah pulled her into a comforting embrace. "It's okay," Sarah murmured, stroking Elizabeth's hair. "Let it out. I'm here." For a long moment, Elizabeth clung to Sarah, letting herself cry in the arms of someone who cared. When her sobs began to subside, Sarah pulled back slightly and looked into Elizabeth's tear-streaked face. You don't have to go back in there, Sarah said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. You don't owe him or anyone else anything after what happened. Elizabeth sniffled and wiped at her face with trembling hands. Sarah, I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice small and shaky. I loved him. I really thought he was the one. But now, she trailed off, her voice breaking again. Sarah's grip on Elizabeth's shoulders tightened slightly. Listen to me, she said, her voice steady and filled with conviction. What he did to you tonight is not okay. Not in private, and especially not in front of all those people. You deserve better than this. Elizabeth nodded weakly, but her mind was spinning. She couldn't reconcile the Anthony she had fallen in love with, the charming, ambitious man who had swept her off her feet, with the one who had humiliated and hurt her tonight. Do you think, Elizabeth began, her voice hesitant, do you think it was just a mistake? A one-time thing? Maybe he was just overwhelmed. Sarah's expression softened, but her tone remained firm. Elizabeth, I understand you want to see the best in him. That's who you are, you're kind and forgiving. But you can't excuse what happened tonight. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something hurtful in the heat of the moment. What he did was not a mistake, it was a choice. Elizabeth's breath hitched as the truth of Sarah's words sank in. She wiped at her cheeks again, trying to steady herself. But I loved him, she said quietly. I still do. How do I just walk away from that? Sarah reached out and took Elizabeth's hands in hers. Love isn't supposed to hurt like this, she said gently. Love is about respect, trust, and kindness. Do you feel respected right now? Do you trust him to never hurt you again? Elizabeth's silence was answer enough. She looked away, her gaze falling to the ground as fresh tears welled up in her eyes. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know if I can trust him anymore. Sarah nodded, understanding the turmoil her friend was going through. It's okay to take time to figure things out, she said. But don't let him pressure you into forgiving him just because he apologizes. You need to think about what's best for you. Elizabeth leaned back against the cold stone wall, closing her eyes as she tried to collect her thoughts. Everyone was watching, she said after a moment, her voice filled with humiliation. They all saw what happened. How do I face them? How do I face myself? Sarah gave her hands a reassuring squeeze. What happened tonight wasn't your fault, she said firmly. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Anthony is the one who should be ashamed. And as for the guests, don't worry about them. The people who truly care about you will stand by your side, no matter what. Elizabeth nodded, drawing a shaky breath. Sarah's words were comforting, but the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't ignore the small voice in the back of her mind that whispered doubts and fears. Could Anthony change? Could she forgive him? And even if she could, would things ever truly be the same? I thought I knew him, Elizabeth said softly, her voice filled with sorrow. I thought he loved me the way I loved him. But now I don't even recognize him. Sarah wrapped an arm around Elizabeth's shoulders, pulling her close again. People can hide who they really are for a long time, she said gently. But the truth always comes out eventually. Maybe tonight was a blessing in disguise. Maybe it's better you saw this side of him, now rather than later. Elizabeth swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. What do I do now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at her with a mixture of empathy and determination. You take it one step at a time, she said. You don't have to make any big decisions tonight. But promise me this. You'll put yourself first. You'll think about what's best for you, not for him, not for anyone else, but for you. Elizabeth nodded slowly, her resolve beginning to build. The path ahead was uncertain, and the thought of walking it alone was terrifying. But deep down, she knew Sarah was right. She couldn't let this moment define her, or dictate the rest of her life. Thank you, Elizabeth said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. I don't know what I'd do without you. Sarah smiled, her eyes warm with affection. You're stronger than you think, Elizabeth, she said. And no matter what happens, I'll be right here with you. Elizabeth took a deep breath, wiping away the last of her tears. The pain and confusion were still there, But for the first time that night, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She deserved better. And she was going to fight for it. Inside the hall, the once celebratory atmosphere had been shattered. The band's lively music had long faded, replaced by the hushed murmurs of confused and uneasy guests. Some stood in tight circles, whispering about what had unfolded. Others avoided making eye contact altogether, choosing instead to quietly sip their champagne and act as though nothing had happened. But for many, the tension was unbearable. Several guests left early, their faces etched with disgust and disappointment. Among them were a few prominent figures, their disapproval palpable. "I won't stay here and condone this," one older woman in a glittering gown muttered to her companion as she gathered her belongings. In the center of it all stood Anthony, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His shoulders were tense, and his jaw was clenched so tightly that a vein throbbed in his temple. His mind raced, replaying the scene over and over, each memory making his chest tighten with a mix of anger, guilt, and humiliation. How had it come to this? His steps were quick and agitated as he muttered to himself under his breath. "She should have told me. She should have been honest," he said, trying to justify what he had done. What else was I supposed to do, with everyone talking about her and Michael? But no matter how much he tried to rationalize his actions, a gnawing feeling of regret lingered in the back of his mind. Deep down, he knew he had crossed a line, one that couldn't easily be undone. He paused for a moment, running a hand through his neatly combed hair, now disheveled. His eyes darted toward the door, where Elizabeth had fled. Every part of him wanted to go after her, to apologize, to make her see his side of things. But his pride rooted him in place, whispering in his ear that he wasn't entirely at fault. "She embarrassed me," he mumbled to himself, shaking his head. "I couldn't just stand there and do nothing." But even as he said the words, they felt hollow. Meanwhile, in a quiet room down the hall, Elizabeth sat surrounded by a small group of her closest friends and family. Her mother sat beside her, holding her hand tightly, while Sarah knelt at her feet, speaking to her softly. "Elizabeth, you don't have to make any decisions right now," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "You just need to focus on yourself. We're here for you." Elizabeth's face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She stared blankly at the floor, her mind replaying Anthony's slap and the judgmental stares of the guests. The sting on her cheek had dulled, but the ache in her heart was relentless. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know who he is anymore. He's not the man I thought I was marrying." Her mother squeezed her hand, her expression a mix of sorrow and guilt. "I should have seen the signs," she said softly. "I should have warned you. But I wanted to believe he was good for you." Sarah nodded in agreement, her brows furrowed. "He's controlling, Elizabeth. He's been like this for a while, hasn't he? This didn't just come out of nowhere." Elizabeth hesitated, her lips trembling. She thought back to the countless little moments over the past few months, the way Anthony dismissed her opinions, the way he insisted on knowing her every move, the subtle but constant pressure to meet his expectations. "He always said it was because he loved me," she said, her voice cracking. "He said he just wanted the best for me." Sarah's jaw tightened. "That's not love, Elizabeth. Love doesn't control. Love doesn't hurt. And love certainly doesn't humiliate you in front of a room full of people." Elizabeth's chest tightened as the weight of Sarah's words sank in. Deep down, she knew her friend was right. But admitting it felt like ripping off a bandage and exposing a wound she had tried so hard to ignore. Back in the hall, Anthony finally stopped pacing. He looked around, noticing how the crowd had thinned. Some guests avoided his gaze, while others stared openly, their expressions a mixture of judgment and pity. One man, a longtime business associate, approached him cautiously. "Anthony," he said quietly, "I don't mean to overstep, but you need to fix this. What happened tonight? People won't forget it." Anthony scowled, his pride bristling at the man's words. "It's none of their business," he said sharply. The man raised an eyebrow. You made it their business when you did that in front of everyone, he said. Take my advice, go to her. Apologize. Before this gets worse. Anthony didn't respond. He hated being told what to do, especially when he already felt like the world was against him. But as the man walked away, his words echoed in Anthony's mind. He glanced at the door again, his feet itching to move. But what would he even say to Elizabeth? Could she forgive him? Did he even deserve her forgiveness? In the quiet room, Elizabeth finally stood up, wiping her tear-streaked face. Her movements were slow, but there was a new resolve in her posture. I need to think, she said, her voice steadier now. I need time to figure out what I want. Sarah stood beside her, her hand resting gently on Elizabeth's shoulder. We'll give you all the time you need, she said. But remember, you don't owe him anything. Not an explanation, not a second chance. Nothing. Elizabeth nodded, taking a deep breath. She looked around at the faces of the people who had stayed by her side, people who truly cared about her. For the first time that night, she felt a glimmer of clarity. Her mother stepped forward, brushing a strand of hair from Elizabeth's face. Whatever you decide, we'll support you, she said softly. Elizabeth gave her a faint smile, the first she had managed since the nightmare began. Thank you, she said. I just need to be alone for a while. As the night wore on, the hall grew emptier. Anthony finally sat down at one of the empty tables, his head in his hands. The whirlwind of emotions, anger, guilt, shame, continued to churn inside him, leaving him exhausted and confused. He thought of Elizabeth, her tear-streaked face, her trembling voice, the way she had looked at him as though she didn't recognize him. The image haunted him, cutting deeper than he cared to admit. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to wonder, had he lost her for good? And if so, could he ever forgive himself? In the days that followed the disastrous wedding reception, Elizabeth found herself in a whirlwind of emotions. She stayed at her mother's house, surrounded by people who loved her and wanted to protect her. But despite their support, she felt lost. The betrayal she had experienced from Anthony had shaken her to her core. She spent hours sitting by the window, staring at the world outside, her thoughts tangled and heavy. Each day brought new attempts at reconciliation from Anthony. First, it was a massive bouquet of roses, delivered with a handwritten note. Elizabeth, I am deeply sorry for everything that happened. I let my emotions get the better of me, and I hurt the person I love most. Please forgive me. Love, Anthony. Elizabeth read the note, but didn't respond. The flowers sat on the kitchen counter, untouched. Her mother noticed and gently asked, Do you want me to get rid of them? Elizabeth shook her head. No, she said softly. I just don't know what to do yet. Anthony didn't stop there. Over the next few days, he sent more gifts, chocolates, a bracelet she had admired once, and even a framed picture of the two of them from happier times. But Elizabeth felt no comfort from his gestures. Instead, they only reminded her of the pain and humiliation she had endured. One evening, Sarah came to visit, bringing a carton of ice cream and her usual blunt honesty. They sat on the couch, the container between them, as Elizabeth poured out her feelings. I just don't know if I can trust him again, Elizabeth admitted, her voice trembling. What if it wasn't just a one-time thing? What if this is who he really is? Sarah nodded, scooping a spoonful of ice cream. Those are valid questions, she said. And honestly, I think you need to ask yourself if you even want to rebuild this relationship. It's not just about forgiving him. It's about whether or not you can feel safe and respected with him moving forward. Elizabeth sighed, staring at the spoon in her hand. I loved him, Sarah. I thought he was my forever. But now, I don't know. It feels like everything we had was a lie. Sarah placed a comforting hand on Elizabeth's arm. It wasn't a lie, she said. But people can change, for better or worse. You have to decide if the person he is now, the person who hurt you, is someone you're willing to take a chance on again. While Elizabeth struggled with her emotions, Anthony was battling his own demons. After the initial shock of what he had done wore off, he realized that apologizing wasn't enough. The shame he felt was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a deep sense of confusion about why he had acted the way he did.
He decided to seek help.
On a quiet afternoon, he walked into a counseling office for the first time in his life. The counselor, a calm and empathetic man named Dr. Lewis, welcomed him into the small, comfortable office. "What brings you here, Anthony?" Dr. Lewis asked, his voice gentle. Anthony hesitated, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I messed up," he said finally. "I hurt someone I love, and I don't even fully understand why. I need to figure out what's wrong with me." Over the next several sessions, Anthony began to open up about his insecurities and fears. He talked about the pressure he felt to maintain control, his need to always appear strong and successful, and the jealousy that had consumed him when he heard about Elizabeth's past relationship. "It's like I couldn't handle the idea that I wasn't the only man in her life who had mattered to her," Anthony admitted one day. "I know it's irrational, but it felt like a threat to everything we had." Dr. Lewis nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like there's a part of you that equates love with possession," he said. "But love isn't about control or dominance. It's about mutual respect and trust. Have you ever felt like you weren't enough, Anthony?" Anthony was quiet for a long moment before he finally nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "I've always felt like I had to prove myself, to be the best at everything. And when I feel like I'm falling short, I lash out." Dr. Lewis leaned forward slightly. "Recognizing that is a big step," he said. "But now, you have to decide what you're going to do about it. Do you want to change, Anthony? Not just for Elizabeth, but for yourself." Anthony looked down at his hands. "I do," he said quietly. "I don't want to be that man anymore." While Anthony worked on himself, Elizabeth continued to seek advice from the people closest to her. She spent hours talking with her mother, who listened patiently but refrained from pushing her in any direction. "You have to trust your instincts," her mother said one evening as they sat on the porch. "If you feel in your heart that he can change and that you can rebuild your trust in him, then maybe it's worth giving him a chance. But if you have any doubts, don't force yourself to stay out of obligation." Elizabeth nodded, staring out at the darkened sky.
"It's just so hard," she said.
"I keep thinking about the good times we had, and I wonder if we can get back to that. But then I remember what happened, and it feels impossible." Her mother reached over and took her hand. "You'll find your answer," she said. "Just don't rush yourself. This is your life, Elizabeth. You deserve to be happy." As the days turned into weeks, Elizabeth found herself reflecting deeply on her relationship with Anthony. She thought about the moments that had made her fall in love with him, the way he had made her feel special and cherished, the dreams they had shared for the future. But she also couldn't ignore the red flags she had overlooked, the subtle signs of his controlling nature that she had brushed aside in the name of love. Meanwhile, Anthony continued to send her messages, not just apologies, but updates about the work he was doing on himself. He told her about his counseling sessions, about the things he was learning and the changes he was trying to make. "I know I can't undo what I did," one message read. "But I want to be better, Elizabeth. Not just for you, but for myself. I hope someday you can see that." Elizabeth appreciated his honesty, but she was still cautious. She needed to see consistent action, not just words, before she could even consider letting him back into her life. The question of whether their relationship could be salvaged hung over both of them like a heavy cloud. For Anthony, the road to redemption was long and uncertain. For Elizabeth, the path to healing required time, space, and a deep reckoning with her own needs and boundaries. In the end, the answer would depend on both of them. Could Anthony truly change? Could Elizabeth rebuild her trust in him? And most importantly, could they find a way to create a relationship that was healthy, respectful, and filled with genuine love? Only time would tell.